Suella Braverman is Liz Truss's new Home Secretary. She takes the job following the resignation of Priti Patel, who used the role to make it more difficult to legally protest in the UK and came up with the horrific Rwanda deportation scheme for refugees. But Braverman could be even worse. These are the reasons you should be worried. Reason number one. In 2019, Braverman gave a speech to the Eurosceptic think tank The Bruges Group, where she said this: "We are engaging in many battles right now. As conservatives, we are engaged in a battle against cultural Marxism, where banning things is becoming de rigueur, where freedom of speech is becoming a taboo, where our universities, quintessential institutions of liberalism, are being shrouded in censorship and a culture of no platforming." That's right. The new Home Secretary used the term cultural Marxism, an anti-Semitic trope usually used by those on the extreme right. When asked if she stood by the use of the slur, despite its connection to the far right, she doubled down, saying, quote, "Yes, I do believe we are in a battle against cultural Marxism, as I said." Less than a year later, Boris Johnson made Braverman Attorney General in his 2019 cabinet, and almost immediately she began widening post-Brexit divisions and concocting culture wars. One of her earliest targets was the judiciary. Now, for context, this was the Daily Mail's front page after the Supreme Court ruled in 2016 that Parliament had to agree to the UK triggering Article 50, the legal instrument that began our withdrawal from the EU. And again, this was its front page after the court ruled that Johnson's 2019 prorogation of Parliament was illegal. Now, arch-Brexiteer Braverman took both cases to show, in her eyes, that the courts were too powerful and set out to limit the ways that judges could hold the government to account. So in 2019, Braverman wrote this: "Courts should operate to curb abuse of power by government, but if a small number of unelected, unaccountable judges continue to determine wider public policy, putting them at odds with elected decision makers, our democracy cannot be said to be representative. Parliament's legitimacy is unrivaled, and the reason why we must take back control, not just from the EU, but from the judiciary." In other words, the government should be the one to decide when it can be held to account. And aside from the power of judges, Braverman has a pretty cavalier approach to the rule of law in general. The government's Northern Ireland Protocol Bill was widely thought to breach international law because it broke the terms of the withdrawal agreement. But Braverman, helpfully for Boris Johnson, advised the government that the bill was totally legal. As Attorney General, she also made a habit of intervening in a dubious manner in ongoing legal cases. For example, following the row over Dominic Cummings' lockdown excursions, she tweeted this: "Protecting one's family is what any good parent does. The 10 Downing Street statement clarifies the situation, and it is wholly inappropriate to politicise it." So this was the person who really was in charge of the rule of law. And such a lax attitude was not applied to people outside of government. After the acquittal of protesters who toppled a statue of Edward Colston, she threatened to refer the case to the Court of Appeal, not on any legal grounds, but simply because she and the Tories didn't like the result. So, that was Braverman as Attorney General, but what will she do in the Home Office? Well, of course, it's early days, but we can get a sense of her priorities by seeing how she pitched herself when seeking to become Prime Minister.
There's many, many priorities, but I think fundamentally we need to deliver some proper tax cuts so that people can be dealing with the cost of living challenges in a more feasible way. We need to shrink the size of the state and cut government spending so we can curb inflation. We need to solve the problem of the boats across the Channel. We need to stop a foreign court interfering in our domestic affairs. We need to make sure the Brexit opportunities are felt for everybody in this country. And lastly, we need to get rid of all of this woke rubbish and actually get back to a country where describing a man and a woman in terms of biology does not mean that you're going to lose your job.
Yes, with all the problems facing Britain, Braverman's priority was demonising asylum seekers and tackling, quote, woke rubbish, whatever that means. On asylum seekers, she's pledged to double down on the Rwanda scheme and wants to put more refugees in detention centres. So anyone hoping Priti Patel's departure will be a benefit on that front is going to be disappointed. And the reference there to the foreign court was to the European Court of Human Rights. And that was a regular target during her leadership campaign.
We can't fix the problem of illegal migration because of human rights claims and because of an interventionist
politicised foreign court in Strasbourg, which is intervening to thwart our domestic policies, as we saw last month on the Rwanda flight. And I'm afraid the only solution to this problem, and if we want to be honest with the British people, on delivering on Brexit, on taking back control over our borders, is that we do now need to leave the European Convention of Human Rights. I've pledged that, and I challenge all my fellow candidates to make that similar pledge. None of them have.
Yet it's not just foreign judges that have found themselves in Braverman's line of fire. And she thinks the problem of a rights culture starts closer to home. Just last month, she gave this speech to the right-wing think tank Policy Exchange.
There is now a serious risk that the fight for rights is undermining democracy and may well harm the very people for whom the fight was originally intended to benefit. In the context of a mature democracy with a responsive and pragmatic common law tradition, is it always right that minority groups impose their claims upon the rest of society? We need to make sure that the costs of protecting rights are worth the payoff. The judicially expanded European Convention on Human Rights and new Labour's Human Rights Act marked a radical change in how fundamental rights are protected in the UK, with alarming constitutional and practical consequences. We now have a rights culture in a way that did not exist prior to 1998. Aspects of this are causing confusion and distress.
A rights culture is causing confusion and distress. Oh, and this is our new Home Secretary. She really hates judges and she really, really hates minority rights. How scared should we be?
I have to say it's her appointment that worried me the most in terms of the cabinet, because it really shows that this government are going to use the machinery of the state to wage, the bully pulpit of the state, if you like, to wage a ceaseless culture war in a way that Boris Johnson's lot toyed around with. But this really puts rocket boosters under it. I mean, actually, what she did there was quite useful because, the term culture war is often it's not a very useful term. It's imprecise. And I think it should be described as a backlash against the claims of minorities for rights, for justice, for equality, for emancipation, for liberation, whatever you want to call it. And that's actually what she was really talking about in her policy exchange talk. I mean, it's backlash. It's backlash weaponized by the political right in order to deflect from class politics, essentially. That's what they use it for. And I think, it's clear with trans people and trans rights where that's going to lead. It should be noted, if you look at the polling of Conservative voters, let alone the rest of the British population, the whole kind of stigmatisation, the really vicious war that's been waged against trans people by the media and increasingly by the political elite, it doesn't have much purchase amongst the population. People just aren't bothered about it, generally speaking. That's not going to stop them having a really good go at it in the way they did. I mean, it was more successful with gay rights in the 80s, to be brutally honest, Michael, because gay people were far less popular in the 1980s. The British Social Attitude Survey showed that negative attitudes got progressively worse in the 1980s. By 1987, over 2/3 of the population believed homosexuality was always wrong or mostly wrong, and only 10% thought otherwise. It was only by 1993 that it got back to its 1983 levels. So when Thatcher introduced Section 28, which was a culture war move, if you like, that was actually very popular and caused kind of chaos amongst the Labour coalition. It did cause problems. Patricia Hewitt, who works for Neil Kinnock, wrote a letter saying this was costing us dearly amongst elderly voters. I mean, pretty gruesome, cynical thing to say, but I mean, it was probably true, to be honest with you. I don't think even though they're going to do that with trans people, and it will be brutal, the consequences for trans people, hate crimes against trans people have quadrupled in the last few years. You and I both know trans people and non-binary people who privately say they don't feel comfortable being in this country anymore and are doing or have made active plans to leave. They're going to make this more of a hostile environment, and they're clearly using this as a wedge issue. It'll be interesting to see what other rights they go for, what other minorities they go for and how they weaponize them. They will try and protect themselves by pointing to representation at the top of the Tory leadership. So I think this will be quite a bitter lesson in terms of representation at the top and actually the impact on people's lives of actual policies, because what they're going to do is tap into the prejudices and insecurities of sections of the population, at the claims of rights of minorities, and they're going to use that to try and put the Labour Party on the back foot. And I'm afraid, knowing the Labour leadership, that is pretty likely to be successful, because rather than having a kind of forceful, courageous pushback, they're likely to get themselves twisted into all sorts of incoherent positions as they worry about alienating some voters, but also mindful of the fact that lots of their voters obviously support the rights of minorities. So that's what Suella Braverman represents. She represents culture war from the bully pulpit of government and the state. They're going to accelerate it. If you thought it was bad under Boris Johnson, then I'm afraid you're going to be in for a pretty gruesome ride, because this is going to get significantly more brutal, vicious, and it will be in tandem with the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, the Times, which is actually one of the worst offenders despite its claims for respectability, the Express, the Sun. It's not going to be fun, I'm afraid.
How do you think this is going to interact with all the other crises that the government is facing? Because, I mean, it's an odd thing to say, but you could see a silver lining in the fact that you've got this cost of living crisis, everything is collapsing, because I do think it seems particularly ridiculous when the Tories do try and make elections about trans rights or these cultural issues, because I think if that was their electoral strategy in 2024, it would essentially fail, right? Because people do have much more material things to think about and that they're worried about. So Labour could quite easily just say, this isn't the issue we're fighting this election on. Why are you talking about this? Everyone cares about energy bills. Everyone cares about the fact that they can't get the operation they're due on the NHS. This is a minor issue. Stop talking about it. I feel like the fact that we're in such a crisis moment will actually make that easier for the Labour Party to do, and maybe the Tories just won't bother trying to exploit it as much because it's a bit of a dead end for them. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I mean, I get what you're saying. I mean, obviously, transphobia doesn't feed your kids, does it? Transphobia doesn't pay the bills. Transphobia isn't an answer to people's everyday problems. Neither is racism. Neither was homophobia. No bigotry, no form of racism ever is. But the reason that the political arms of economic elites deploy these attempts to scapegoat and to stigmatize minorities is precisely often at moments of economic and social distress, because they believe that if people's attention and fury is focused on minorities that aren't hurting them at all, then they won't be thinking about the various oil and gas companies who are making massive profits and are being protected by the Conservative Party. So you're right on one level. Obviously, rationally, it's patently absurd that you have we are obviously in a protracted worst crisis since the war. I know that's been going on for quite a while in various different forms, the pandemic and then the aftermath. But it is in moments of distress. I mean, you could say, look back in history of terrible, terrible moments of national trauma, and various, right-wing parties and the elites are focusing on scapegoating and attacking minorities. But that's why they do it. They're doing it because they know it deflects attention, it deflects anger, and therefore it's good for the political right to weaponize. So, yeah, I'm afraid they will accelerate it. It might not work, You're absolutely right. As I've said, transphobia does not have the purchase that homophobia did. I don't think people realize, including, I'm older than you, obviously, but geriatric millennial, people don't realize just how much of pervasive homophobia and how toxic it was not that long ago. It still obviously exists, but it's nowhere near what it was in the past. And transphobia is not up there. So yeah, I see it's not, as effective, but it won't stop them trying. And the issue is not that will it in the end succeed, because I think trans people will get their rights and security in the end. It's just how much damage and hurt can be done along the way. And I'm afraid that's quite a lot. And that's what the Tories are going to try to do, whether or not it succeeds.